President Trump announced his next White House chief of staff Friday. Congressman Mark Meadows will assume the role. The Republican has been a staunch ally of the Trump administration. This is the first time since 2018 the position will be filled permanently. On Twitter, the president said he has worked with Meadows for a long time, adding, quote, "The relationship is a good one." Meadows replaces the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney. President Trump thanked Mulvaney for his work and announced he will next become the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Jiang is on the phone with me now. Hi, Weijia. So what more do we know about the decision to name Meadows as chief of staff at this point? What does the timing also tell us?
You know, it's not necessarily surprising, Tanya, because this is sort of a brand new era for the Trump presidency. He has impeachment totally behind him. He is now laser focused on his reelection in 2020. So it makes sense that he wants somebody new to lead the charge, not to mention that he's had a tumultuous relationship with Mulvaney as a result of developments in the impeachment proceedings. So this is not shocking, I should say. But you know, there has been lots of speculation for several months that this could happen, that Meadows could be tapped for the job. And that's because he is one of the president's staunchest defenders and one of his most loudest defenders on Capitol Hill. And they really have a strong bond that they are actually public about. I mean, they speak about each other frequently. The president often praises Meadows. And I think you hit something really on the nail here when you mentioned that there is no acting in front of Meadows' title. And, you know, something that Mulvaney was never able to achieve was to become the permanent chief of staff. And even though the president says that has nothing to do with his confidence in Mulvaney, it is really telling, because if that were the case, why isn't there an acting disclaimer in front of his new chief of staff, Mark Meadows? So I think Mulvaney always struggled to really gain 100% of the president's confidence. It was almost like he was always auditioning for the job that he ultimately did not get.
So, yes, tell us a little bit more about the relationship between President Trump and Mulvaney, because obviously this is a clear demotion, becoming the special envoy to Northern Ireland. Do you believe that at this point Mulvaney saw it coming?
I think he did, and I think he probably knew that he was going to be on the chopping block after he held that now infamous press briefing about Ukraine. And just so you and our viewers remember, he essentially admitted that there was a quid pro quo with regard to the U.S. military aid to Ukraine and investigations into the Bidens. And he even said something like, "That's the way it works, get over it." He said that there were three main issues that the money was held up. And one of them was whether or not Ukraine would cooperate in an ongoing investigation with the Department of Justice. Now, after that, he tried to walk it back, and he tried to say that that's not what he meant, but it was very hard to do that. And if you remember, Tanya, that was a really critical time for President Trump. He was already under such scrutiny. We know that impeachment really got to under his skin in a way that we haven't seen before, except for the Mueller report. And if you ask the president, he would say that impeachment was just an extension of that. And really, that's been, you know, overshadowing his presidency since day one. So for Mick Mulvaney to come out in public and basically admit the reason why the president held up the aid was because he wanted these investigations was really the beginning of the end for Mulvaney. In fact, after that, you know, I remember we started asking the president about Mulvaney's job security. And you know, every month or every few weeks, somebody would ask from the press corps, "Hey, is Mick Mulvaney still your chief of staff? Are there any plans to get rid of him?" And he was always really adamant that he had a great relationship with Mulvaney and that he was going to continue to serve as chief of staff. But the truth is,
right,
after impeachment wrapped up, you know, it sort of it was well known that
Right.
Mulvaney was going to get the boot.
That question about Mulvaney certainly never went away. So, Weijia, Meadows is a sitting congressman. Is this going to leave his seat vacant? And tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Meadows and President Trump.
So right now we don't know much about the timing. All we know is what the president has tweeted. And if it's a Friday and if somebody is vulnerable, then there's a good chance that the president is going to fire them or replace them via tweet. Unfortunately, so far we have not received more details from the White House or from any of our sources because, again, this is the president's show. They don't want to get ahead of the president, and certainly the big question is whether there will be a transition period, what that will look like, and when the official start date will be for Meadows, because you're right now he has another job. He did announce earlier that he was not going to seek re-election, but certainly we expected that he would finish his term, which ends in January of 2021. So that would leave a seat vacant if he were to immediately start, which it seems like he will, because again, the president's sole focus right now is, I should not say sole, but one of his main priorities is trying to keep his job in the White House. And so, he's going to want to get to work quickly and make sure that his chief of staff is on board and in touch with the rest of his team to lead the way to re-election. So what I can tell you is that, again, these two are extremely close. They talk very often. And that's because during impeachment, especially, Meadows was such, in the president's eyes, a powerful and a strong defender of his. And he thinks he really made an impact to defend him. And if you'll remember, the president, in many ways, was defender-in-chief with regard to other White House officials. He was the one, messaging himself and laying out his defense when it came to people on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, on the other side of that, though, there were some stars that emerged as some of the president's loudest supporters on Capitol Hill, and Meadows was really one of those. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's no surprise that he's been chosen to be the new chief of staff.
And Weijia, he's certainly, though, stepping into a role that hasn't been easy for the people who have come before him. Remind us of the president's relationship with those who have served as his chief of staff before.
Well, let's just take a look at General John Kelly, who was the chief of staff before Mick Mulvaney. That relationship was just spinning out of control. And by the end, despite a nice tweet from the president and thanking General Kelly, there was definitely no love lost. And since Kelly left, he's been very vocal in criticizing President Trump and saying it was really hard to work for him because this is a man who is a four-star general who was brought into the White House to restore order in what was perceived as a pretty chaotic place. And, he just could not do that because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who the chief of staff is, right? Because President Trump is his own boss, and he is his own chief. And so I think that's partly why Mulvaney kept the job for as long as he did, because unlike Kelly, Mulvaney sort of took a back seat to the president and was not that loud, stern voice in his ear, but rather, acquiesced to the president and allowed him to make decisions, and wasn't so quick to offer contrary views, unlike Kelly. And so I think it is difficult to work for this president, according to other former administration officials, because he is so stubborn and set in his ways. And so I think, perhaps that's why he chose someone who he views as such a loyalist, because he wants to establish that relationship that he hasn't been able to have so far, at least for the long haul.
Right.
Now, when you look at Reince Priebus, his first chief of staff, that was someone who was with him, beside him during the entire campaign, and someone who he really trusted. But, you know, it's not necessarily abnormal for a switch to happen, especially, again, when you can view a presidency in such clear stages. And again, you know, we have moved way beyond impeachment at this point, looking forward to the next chapter. And so that's why he wants somebody new.
All right. Well, once again, Mark Meadows is President Trump's new chief of staff. Weijia Jiang, thank you so much for that.
Sure. Thanks.
We're going to take a quick break now. More news ahead. You're streaming CBSN.